We've had three fantastic presentations looking at some of the manufacturing strategies within the industry. And we're kind of going to move those presentations towards looking at some of the bottlenecks within biomanufacturing. I love the phrase bottleneck because it brings up such imagery that really describes the sort of problems that we have when it comes to the manufacturing flow. Kieran, I actually want to ask you first. When one of your slides, you were looking at companies asking the right questions and the importance there when it comes to technologies and strategies. Do bottlenecks feature prominently in that list of questions in your experience?
They don't.
They don't.
They should. They don't, but they should. I think everybody gets so focused on what's ahead of them that they fail to realize what's behind them. And I think asking the question, what are our bottlenecks? Where are we struggling to meet the customer demands or the customer challenges should be one of the things that we're asking, but it isn't oftentimes, unfortunately.
And Ray and Courtney, do you have any experience of management or upper levels realizing the importance of bottlenecks ahead of time here?
It comes to the bottom line, right? To supply the clinic, for example. So the intricacies of what it takes to get a product to a patient is known, but there's just so many different areas that need to come together to make that happen that it's maybe hard to wrap your head around. But just in terms of the various suppliers and then the quality organization and the regulatory, so all those different pieces need to come together. So it's known and it's understood. It's just vast.
Yeah, and I would say that in my experience is primarily process development and manufacturing, it's clearly understood that there are bottlenecks, and certainly it's a frustration for manufacturing. It's a real challenge though, because you have to get from the pilot plant all the way, you have to prove feasibility all the way through manufacturing, right? Because nobody wants to implement a new process that can't be scaled up through manufacturing. You need enough material to be able to do that. And of course, there's such a focus on speed to market that the implementation of newer technologies often takes a backseat to the speed to market issue, right? So it's a real challenge. It's a cart and an egg or cart and a horse issue that they all seem to have.
So yeah, when you say speed to market, obviously everyone knows the importance of getting a molecule as quickly through the clinical stages as possible. But a bottleneck comes along, that's gonna put companies back by by sometimes years, no?
Well, no, I think they plan for it in manufacturing development, right? So they're scaling based on the current technologies that they have in their platform that work. So the bottleneck becomes in an existing facility, perhaps the amount of buffer that they can manufacture or utilize at a time, the size of the columns and supporting equipment that they have. So they overcome it by not changing the technology, simply scaling larger for the most part.
And thinking about your original question about bottlenecks for the companies or clients that I work with, so I tend to cut across all functions. So it's not operations specific or supply specific, which I think though the term bottleneck tends to arise a lot more frequently. I think the word unmet need is what we use to describe quote unquote bottlenecks. How do we address this challenge and how do we continue to grow? And when we think about the unmet need, I think that is on the radar of all the executives that I speak to, because they know, even if all of the employees may have forgotten or several of the employees may have forgotten or lost sight, that we're here for the customer. And if we don't meet that customer need, whatever that unmet need might be, we're going to not grow as fast or we're going to fail to thrive, conversely.
I forgot to mention at the beginning of this is an interactive panel discussion. So if anyone does have a question at any time, then raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you or we'll get you to shout it out. But in the meantime, historically, where have the bottlenecks been within the biomanufacturing space? Is it the upstream to downstream, or were there earlier examples of bottlenecks that industry has overcome?
I actually have an idea about this, and it's less of a bottleneck. It's a challenge to turn on the faucet. So I've been talking quite a lot with a couple of universities about their training and development programs to supply the talent into the biopharmaceutical space, whether it's trained engineers or scientists to be able to do the job that we need for a rapidly growing industry. And the problem is there just isn't enough talent there. And so bottleneck, faucet not turning on, the same concept, same principle applies. The biggest challenge right now seems to be getting trained talent through the doors to be able to do the job we need of them. And what we're seeing is people jumping, just in Cambridge alone, jumping from organization to organization just because the retention programs are not so great. And then there's a dearth of talent. And so they're picking up the talent where they can, and the retention programs are doing the best that they can. There's just a shortage of talent, a lot like what you see in Silicon Valley.
In terms of ADC specifically for bottlenecks, just the lead time it takes to get a product to the patient. So just making the MAB in and of itself, and I'm sure you can speak to this as well, is a long lead item, right? And then sometimes getting into your supplier schedule and having that agility as your clinical needs change and your program is shifting in its timeline. Having the flexibility to manage all of the different manufacturing nodes can tend to be a challenging proposition.
That's just while we're talking ADCs, obviously one of the questions I asked you there was during your presentation was on the complexity of manufacturing an ADC. When you've got an antibody, a small molecule, and you've got the bioconjugation to do, does that theoretically give you free times the opportunity to have bottlenecks, 3 times the problems? Is that kind of how it equates?
Sure, absolutely. And in some ways, they're individual entities, right? That just as much as a MAB can have, a standalone MAB can have bottlenecks, the MAB that feeds into your ADC would have those same problems, potentially.
So how does, I guess a CDMO manage those sort of 3 different loads?
Yeah, so it's having a good understanding of the clinical demand and your program timelines. As you're understanding what your dosing strategy is going to be, and then what your clinical study design is, to have that mapped out so that you can anticipate. And then as programs come and go based on their outcomes, having the ability to switch gears and supply other programs as needed.
Okay, and Ray, going back to the original question there, historically, where have you seen the most bottlenecks or the biggest problem, and have we overcome it as an industry?
Yeah, no, there'll always be a bottleneck, right? So I think that in biopharmaceutical manufacturing, clearly the upstream side is ahead of the downstream side. If you think back to 15 years ago, date myself, all the discussion was about, it's centered on insufficient bioreactor volume capacity in the United States. They were building 15,000 liter bioreactors, right? As the upstream side caught up in science and titers increased, the requirement for large-scale bioreactors came down. And so now the new bottleneck is in downstream processing. And one of those very, very clear areas is in protein A capture of antibodies. It's a very templated process, so it lends itself to economic stress, right, and economic drivers. And hence one of the reasons why there's so much discussion around protein A chemistries. And the other thing is a very expensive unit operation because of the cost of the resin. So there's a lot of economic pressure to drive that cost down and reduce the scale of capture. And certainly once that process is more optimized, the bottleneck simply moves, right? So I think there'll always be a bottleneck. It just depends on what does the industry decide to do to get around that? What's the acceptance of the new technologies?
So it's kind of getting pushed along the line, upstream, downstream, but there will always be a bottleneck. Is essentially what you're saying.
Yes.
Kieran, sorry.
So the fun part of what I do is walk the floors to see what's going on, what kind of products people have. And as you're talking, I can't remember the name of the company, but there is a company here that has a synthetic resin that can displace protein A. So bottlenecks arise, and the great thing about this industry is that it's innovative. Roadblocks and challenges don't exist for very long because people find workarounds. They find a way to innovate through, over, and around. So that's why when you say what are the bottlenecks, I feel like the bottlenecks keep shifting. Like we're looking at the next challenge and the next challenge, and it's temporal. I mean, it exists for a short period of time until someone finds a way to innovate and work through the challenge or that hurdle. And that's what I love about this industry.
So someone finds where the problem is, and then suddenly a bunch of companies try and address that, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Right, okay. I do want to, and you mentioned talent before, I do want to park that for a moment and come back to talent later on in this discussion. But Courtney, Ray, how do you feel about the sort of innovators in this hall or in the industry as a general, kind of addressing all these problems as and when they arise?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a huge amount of intellectual horsepower in the industry, which is, I think, what makes it the most amount of fun. Conversely, though, there's also a reluctance to change because of regulatory environment. FDA has been touting continuous manufacturing for quite a bit of time, yet we've seen upstream, again, lead downstream, but there's not been a lot of discussion around a truly integrated, continuous approach to manufacturing. And I always go back to antibodies because it's such an easy process. Technically, it's probably one of the easiest processes we work with. It's the most templatable. So it in many respects, it lends itself to leading the curve, if you will, on establishing a continuous manufacturing model. Yet it's very difficult to get to that level for a couple of reasons. Number one, speed to market, obviously, right? Risk mitigation. Nobody wants to be the first, right? The leading indicators, right? Nobody. It's early. It's difficult to get an early adopter. And one of the interesting things is it's also a very niche-oriented opportunity. If you had a blockbuster that you knew was going to be worth several $1 billion a year, you would be reluctant to implement a new process that would slow down your regulatory approval and your speed to market. Conversely, if you have a very, very small a small market molecule, a very specific antibody that was almost orphan drug status, for example, the value of continuous manufacturing perhaps wouldn't be apparent. So you have a window of opportunity to establish a new process like that, and huge barriers to overcome because nobody's done it yet. So there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of work being done in process development on continuous manufacturing, but it's very difficult to get to the next step with it. So.
Yep, I agree with everything you said. I'm in the area of science and technology for my company, and we have ideas of what we want to implement, but finding that program that's appropriate can be the challenge. In my experience, it's about having the proof of concept completed as a sort of standalone activity, so that when that program presents itself, that we can apply that. It's at the ready. But it's very challenging to impose a risk or a perceived risk to either supply or timeline. So as much as we can to do proof of concept ahead of time for that new technology, that gives us a fighting chance to implement it.
So once you've got the proof of concept, then you're kind of, you've overcome 2/3 of that problem, say.
Yep.
Something that you just mentioned there with continuous, the continuous processing in the downstream. I found that quite interesting. How you kind of hinted that continuous processing was brought up as a potential way to debottle the upstream to downstream process, but it's kind of been adopted by the upstream process in the form of perfusion, and in many ways, it's more advanced in the upstream than it has ever been in the downstream. What is it with the upstream? Is it just there are more people looking at developing processes in the up to the down, or is it just easier to do in the upstream?
I don't know. I don't honestly know. And maybe somebody out, especially on the upstream side, has a better feel for it. It may simply be that the risk, it's not such a huge paradigm shift to go from fed batch or batch to perfusion.
Yeah.
Although there's certainly hurdles that had to be overcome in the process change, right? Um, uh, Sterility sampling, keep maintaining sterility when you're harvesting continually, length of validation of the length of period of the perfusion process. There's certainly a large number of items that had to be overcome to move that process. But the upstream side has always seemed to be ahead of the downstream side in this respect, to me. I don't know. You guys,
Jared.
So I think something you said earlier probably addresses why there's greater pace of innovation in upstream is because of these 15,000 liter bioreactors, and the CapEx cost or the capital equipment costs to purchase those is far greater than if you modify your processes rather than building bigger facilities. So I think the industry got wiser early on and said, look, we don't need bigger, badder facilities. We need to be operationally far more efficient. And that roadblock at the time was in the upstream in yields. And they solved that challenge. And I think that the reason downstream hasn't innovated as frequently or at the pace of upstream is if it isn't broken, don't fix it, right? And there is only one solution. It's really protein A for the most part. So there's really nothing else that's been challenging it until today. Until today.
So in that respect, is the adoption of single use the answer to many bottleneck issues within the industry? As industry takes on single use in the upstream, does that help sort of clear the path into the downstream?
I'm biased because I worked at Thermo Fisher running their high clone cell culture teams, their global marketing team. So we are biased. We do believe that single use is a really neat solution to the problems that were faced by these companies with these large, massive facilities, and then the cleaning costs and the turnover costs. And then people want to enter the market or enter this industry. Single use is a really nifty solution to get them on the ground running a lot faster than what industry did 10, 15 years ago. And now we're seeing the same happen in cell and gene therapy. It's the solution that people are relying on because the volumes are so much smaller than what you're accustomed to in the biologics manufacturing, and they go, single use, that's a no-brainer. So I am a fan of single use.
Courtney?
Yes, I'm also a fan of single use. It does help with like cleaning, and you don't have to develop the analytical methods necessarily to demonstrate for the high potent containment. So the ability to use a single use train for your processing of conjugation, for example, allows you to get into the suite and manufacture without having to spend the months and months it would take to develop an analytical method and the resource it would take. So single use can definitely help debottleneck some of those processes.
And I would argue that it addresses a portion of the problem, but it certainly doesn't address the whole problem. As your titer of your bioreactor goes up, if you don't do something to address the downstream and make it more efficient, single use is going to get you a step in that direction. And I don't have a stake in I don't have a real argument in one way or the other, but I think it gets you partway, but I don't think you can rely on that to be the answer. It is an answer. It's part of the solution, but I don't think there is a solution. I think it's part of the solution.
So if you use single-use bioreactors in the upstream, is that going to cause different problems further down the line than if you use stainless steel? Is it just going to
so.
Either shift the problems or just create new ones here and there?
I'm not even sure they're coupled.
No?
I don't know that it's necessarily coupled. If you have the utilities available to support non-single-use downstream manufacturing, I think you could clearly couple that with single-use bioreactors. I don't know that there would be any reason why one would necessarily influence the other directly.
I'm thinking more from the conjugation unit operations for single use, where there's oftentimes solvent present. And so the application of single use just needs to be implemented early on so that you can demonstrate leachable, extractable, and have stability on your product that was made in single use. That can be done at lab scale first, and then if you have a platform, say typical solvent content and your platform material of construction, it's very easy to implement from future programs.
Right, okay.
So one thing that I haven't heard yet this morning, and I haven't really seen a lot when I walk the floor, is one of the potential solutions for continuous manufacturing, which is the automation arm or the software arm that pulls it all together. And I think single use, like you said, is a solution, but it is not the perfect solution. And I think if we start looking at the problem or the challenge from a top-down perspective and think about how we can utilize software, which I don't think this industry is too familiar, understands it. We're scientists, we work in biology, we don't work in code. But the same level of innovation and passion exists in both. And I think we need to start pulling software into what we do as an industry, because we'll find that software is going to probably fix a lot of what's broken or the gaps, and it'll actually create the level of transparency which is missing in our processes today.
From attending lots of trade shows and conferences across the biomanufacturing space, it's interesting what you say there about automation and software. I'm hearing it more and more, but specifically focused in the cell and gene therapy space. They've got separate issues to the manufacture of monoclonal antibodies, but they seem to have gone straight for software and automation to try and fix them. I'm wondering, in your experience, if you find that is the case, and why is that part of the industry looking at software and automation, and mAb manufacture kind of isn't?
Having a foot in either one of those segments, I can tell you, because cell and gene therapy incorporates the patient as part of its supply chain, there's greater risk in the not knowing and not having that level of transparency, because the risk to a single patient is so much greater than if you're building out batches and testing and validating, because you have a direct line to a person that you're hoping to help. And this could go in so many different directions because it is a relatively new, uncharted territory. And so they're realizing very quickly that software and automation can provide that level of transparency and risk mitigation, which doesn't exist today. And so I think they're faster to adopt those kind of solutions because they have a greater need. They have a bigger monkey on their back than I would venture to guess is biopharma. Although we do. But it's that one patient, one solution. Yeah. That's a big responsibility for anyone.
Okay. No, I was just going to comment. I do think that the large bulk antibody manufacturers are changing their strategy. Typically, if you think back to a few years ago, everything was based on an island of automation, right? You had unit operations. Each of those operations had their own control platform, and they didn't necessarily speak to a DCS. I think more than 50% of manufacturing now incorporates a DCS type of solution, a Delta V solution, as opposed to Rockwell, where all of the different unit operations all of the batch records are mustered in a single location. They are electronically based. So I do think the large bulk manufacturers are moving in that direction as well. So I'm not sure where's it.
So sort of centralized analytics and.
Yes.
Would that include real-time monitoring?
Yes, real-time monitoring. Not necessarily the analytics. I don't know. Actually, that's a great question. I don't know, in terms of all of the assays that are done, how centralized that data. I'm thinking of the pure manufacturing steps, though. There is a tendency towards going towards a DCS approach, a plant-wide system, as opposed to islands of automation, I believe.
Right. And Courtney.
That's okay. I just wanted to comment that having that real-time monitoring and all of the parameters, for example, available in an electronic system is very useful in the early stages as you're scaling up and you're moving into a new facility, and you might have limited process understanding for an accelerated program, for example. The ability to have additional monitoring early on to make sure that what you're making at scale is the same as what you made in the lab. And then the expectation from the agencies that you are monitoring throughout the course of the life cycle. So it doesn't stop at validation; it goes all the way through to continuous process verification. And so the ability to have those data available in a central location so that you can track and trend is an agency expectation, but very challenging.
Sorry, go on.
No.
I just wanted to know a bit more about real-time analytics, because to me, the idea of that being a major bottleneck for certain manufacturing modalities kind of fits in with what we were saying at the beginning, where problems are pushed further and further along the manufacturing chain. Yeah. And it kind of feels if industry can incorporate real-time analytics and overcome some of the issues with assays and such, mm-hmm. then we're kind of clear sailing, or am I just being far too optimistic?
Ideally, I would like to run a process that I can just set a reaction time and temperature and set it and kind of forget it, if you will. But the reality is that early on, you just don't have that figured out yet. And so the real-time monitoring is key. So as you're preparing your antibody for conjugation, you want to know, is it fully reduced? Is that complete? Or is the conjugation complete before you forward process? So in the early stages of development, having that real-time analytics is very important. And in transferring a process to a new facility, you have to get those assays validated in the QC lab, and then the time it takes to run those assays. So the ability to do that as fast as possible is sometimes very important. Sometimes the reaction that you're trying to monitor will be complete by the time you submit your sample to QC.
Looking to the future, I'm wondering if there's anything in the manufacture of antibodies or perhaps any emerging therapies that is kind of a ticking time bomb waiting to happen. If you've noticed something that kind of worries you that it may be a bottleneck into the future. Any areas that industry needs to be slightly aware of?
I think it's insightful.
No, we're all good for the future. Kieran.
I don't know if it's a ticking time bomb, but I see across industries and I see different companies. And my what I ask of industry is adopt software. I really think that's going to solve some of these challenges around transparency, what's happening, the automation component. So I don't see it as a bottleneck. I just wish they would adopt it faster.
Right, so software, and back to the analytics issue. Go on, Raymond.
I was going to say the only thing I kind of think of at the top level, and I'm probably not the best person to comment on it, but is the advent of biosimilars. I mean, so the whole economic model around antibody manufacturing and development, has the potential to change, I think, and that's obviously a huge driver for the industry over time.
So we'll see how biosimilars play out, especially in the US. I did promise you, Kieran, that we'd parked the talent issue, which I guess is a manufacturing bottleneck, but kind of a different one to what we're talking about. This afternoon we have Eric Langer presenting, and within his annual BioPlan survey reports, talent is a major issue, as you pointed out.
Okay.
I'm wondering if anyone on the panel or even in the audience has concerns about industry recruiting more talent to fill some of the gaps that we're seeing, and therefore help to alleviate those bottlenecks in the future.
The reason why this came up is because I've been talking to the Jefferson Institute for Bioprocessing. They purchased the U.S. rights to do the curriculum from Cork from Ireland. Now it's escaping me. The Nibert. Yes, that's correct. And so I've been talking to them for probably 6 months. They're servicing, the Philadelphia area. Jefferson's based in Philadelphia. It's where I grew up. And so I'm fairly passionate about education, continuing education, and servicing a need. And they've identified a big need. And it isn't just the highly skilled labor and scientists. It's who do we get into the door to do clean room cleaning? How do we get high school educated, trained, skilled, certified professionals. So it is both, the skilled and trained workers as well as it is the highly educated workers that they're trying to address. And so Pervez, who is the executive director for JIB, is circulating. I think he's giving a talk just right now at the moment. And so that's what prompted me to think about it, is because I know they're trying to address those challenges by filling the needs, not just at the highest level of education and training, but across all of what the needs are within biomanufacturing and bioprocessing.
And when there's a lack of talent, obviously salaries are going to be skyrocketing, which
exactly right.
creates huge costs further down the line.
Yeah.
I've got an 8-year-old. I tell him, don't go into journalism, become a bioprocess engineer, because that will sort me out in my retirement. But I guess that is a major issue that we're going to have to tackle, and hopefully it's a subject that we can continue on this stage later on with the future presentations. I think we're going to close up the panel now, unless anyone has a specific question on, a general question even on bottlenecks or on some of the subjects we've discussed. Nope. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank all three of our presenters and our panelists, and I would like to remind everyone that we're going to have a short break for 15 minutes or so you can get a drink or a bit of lunch, and we're going to carry on the Bioprocess International Theatre this afternoon with a session looking at the identifying and implementing tools for process optimization. As I said, Eric Langer from Bioplan Associates will be talking, as will Andy Davis from Prometic Bioseparation and Kelsey Achenbach from Roquette. And they will be presenting from 1 o'clock, followed by another panel discussion looking at how and when to optimize processes within the biomanufacturing space. Thank you so much for attending.